Welcome to a walk through the Bahr Gallery exhibition called the Hippie Ethos, which features posters that in some way express the hippie lifestyle and culture from that late 1960s utopian period where it was believed that love could change the world. We're going to start by talking about the background of this period and this show. For a while, maybe 1966 to mid-1968, a successful utopian experiment captured the imagination of much of the youth of America, drawing on utopian traditions which date back centuries and fueled by the euphoric and psychoactive powers of marijuana and LSD. The 60s, such as we remember them, or not, hosted a creative explosion in the arts, music, and fashion, combined with a belief that the world could be born anew. Characterized by the vivid, flowing colors of psychedelic art and music, and a belief that love was the solution to all problems, hippie culture set out to transform the world by rejecting every social, political, economic, and aesthetic feature of mainstream Western society. The hippie ethos, or lifestyle, was a total rejection of their parents' generation. Its ideals, social norms, prejudices, clothing, music, film, and more. It was a turnabout that exploded into the national consciousness in a mere handful of years. From the first hints of civil rights protests, women's liberation, psychedelic music, and longer hair in 1965, by August 1969, it was Woodstock Nation. This exhibition at the Bahr Gallery shines a light on some of the posters that expressed the visual universe of that hippie generation, from wild new clothing, posters to get stoned to, embrace of Native American Eastern religions, and back to nature themes, freeform dancing, unabashed nudity, protests against the war, head shop posters, health food stores, and other themes that boldly stated, "Here we are, America, your sons and daughters," and not to mention the music. Posters were not incidental to the hippie experience. In fact, they were a central part of it. Hippies and 60s youth embraced the poster as inexpensive, disposable art that could express the way they felt and later be torn down and replaced with other posters. They didn't need bulky frames like the art of their parents' generation, and indeed posters were often plastered back to back and climbed up the walls and even across the ceiling. Often, the clash of generations ended up with some exasperated version of, "We don't care what you do, as long as it stays in your room." The hippies owed a lot to the pioneering efforts of the beat generation of the 1950s. Central elements of beat culture were rejection of mainstream values and materialism, the spiritual quest including Eastern religions, experimentation with marijuana and speed, and sexual liberation and exploration. The members of the beat generation developed a reputation as new bohemian hedonists who celebrated nonconformity and spontaneous creativity. The Beats expressed their alienation from convention or "square" society by adopting a seedy style of dress and manners and using hip vocabulary borrowed from jazz musicians. Generally apolitical, they advocated personal release, purification, and illumination through the heightened sensory awareness that might be induced by drugs, jazz, sex, or the discipline of Zen Buddhism. While the hippies inherited a tradition of cultural descent from bohemians and beatniks, there was also a bit of friction initially between the two groups. The Beats derisively called the younger generation coming up hippies, which stood for junior grade hipsters or wannabes. And unlike the gloomy Beats, hippies were exuberant. As Charles Perry wrote in his 1985 book, Haight-Ashbury, the Beats looked down on the hippies as imitation bohemians who were only interested in getting stoned and having a good time, rather than doing something serious, like writing poetry or playing jazz. 1960s style began with skirts getting shorter and hair growing longer. There was a much more casual attitude toward sex as women had gained access to the pill and were no longer bound to the prospect of a lifelong monogamous relationship. That men eventually took advantage of this was not one of the finest legacies of the period. Clothing was casual, often unconventional, and veered wildly among bright and wild patterns. Striped bell-bottom pants, Nehru jackets, Mandarin collars, African prints, scarves, headbands, fringed vests, boots, Ruffled shirts, granny glasses, and bras, well, they were optional. Men grew beards, and both women and men wore sandals and beads. Fashion was, quite literally, up for grabs and open to individual interpretation. At the core of these changes stood the drugs of a new generation, marijuana and LSD. Much of the art and music of the late 60s was either influenced by or attempted to recreate or enhance the psychedelic experience. These psychoactive drugs often led to a spiritual search as part of the quest for expanded consciousness, or satori. They commonly sought spiritual guidance from sources outside the Judeo-Christian tradition, particularly Buddhism, Hinduism, and other Eastern religions, and sometimes in various combinations. Hippies often practiced open sexual relationships and lived in various types of family groups, and later communes. They often adopted vegetarian diets and practiced holistic medicine. For many, the Whole Earth Catalog, which first appeared in 1968, became a source for the necessities of life. Deeply suspicious of both society and government, referred to commonly as the man, they embraced individualism as a true expression of authenticity. However, this attitude left hippies sometimes feeling isolated and lonely, which explains why the Love generation sought community, and in the late 60s and early 1970s, several thousand communes were sprinkled across the land. Astrology, tarot, and the I Ching were also popular, and the period was often referred to as the Age of Aquarius, a time when humanity reaches its destiny, being the revolution of truth, freedom from the past, and the expansion of consciousness. The 1968 Broadway musical Hair, with its opening song Aquarius and the line, "This is the dawning of the Age of Aquarius," brought the Aquarian Age concept to the attention of audiences worldwide, and Woodstock was billed as an Aquarian exposition. Public gatherings, part music festivals, sometimes protests, often simply excuses for celebrations of life, were an important part of the hippie movement. The first be-in, called the Gathering of the Tribes, was held in San Francisco on January 14, 1967, and 30,000 people attended. It presaged the Summer of Love, wherein more than 100,000 members of the counterculture and teenagers traveled across the United States and converged in the Haight-Ashbury district. Many came for the Monterey International Pop Festival that June, but others were drawn to San Francisco, to the utopian visions of peace and love. The hippie ideal was said to hear its death knell at the tragic Altamont concert in December 1969. Hippies moved off to communes, or perhaps grew up, as their parents would no doubt put it. The 1970s, known as the Me generation, were born of the notion that before we could change the world, we had to change our own individual selves. But while the hippie utopian dream ended, it left behind a cultural revolution over the long term. The hippie period ushered in more relaxed attitudes towards sex, attire, and a widespread lessening of formality. It was hippie culture's philosophy of taking care of the earth that spawned the pro-environmental movement, including recycling, organic food, vegetarianism, and forest preservation, just to name a few. The hippies had a positive philosophy of loving your neighbor. They embraced ethnic and cultural diversity and tolerance and sought to be authentic to themselves. A sense of optimism, hope, and joy prevailed. They spoke up for what they believed in, and they believed they could change the world for the better.